Well, thank you. If this is too loud, let me know. It seems to be too loud to me. But first, a word about the image. Amitabh Chaudhry asked me to send an image along for the talk, and I have actually put together a small PowerPoint presentation, which Adnan was teasing me about, but this is a new effort for me. This is a portrait of Charles II, of course, complete with his famous spaniels, and he's dressed sort of cavalierly here with a beaver hat and so forth. I was looking for an image of royalty which conveyed, on the one hand, condescension and on the other, civility or homage. It's just quite hard to find, actually, in royal portraiture. You tend to find pictures of majesty and military triumph and so forth. But there is a slight absurdist touch to this, in that it's actually not a subject paying homage or begging for some favor from his monarch. It's a gardener presenting Charles II with a pineapple. You can't quite see it, but he has a pineapple in his hands. This is supposedly the first pineapple grown in England. Dated to 1677 or at least 1677, because 1677 was the year when Charles II shaved his mustache, and Charles II does not have a mustache. So there are several sort of amusing layers to this portrait. Debates about liberalism have been dominated for years by a face-off between John Rawls and his communitarian critics. But in the past 15 years, they have been enriched by the presence of a neo-republican position, as it's called. This school of thought has been theoretically informed by the work of Philip Pettit and historically informed by the work of Quentin Skinner. This neo-republicanism has at once offered theoretical norms for the conduct of politics and historical claims for reading the history of European political thought. And this paper is going to try to contest or challenge some of the normative claims of the school by looking at what I take to be some of the historical errors of their efforts at historical reconstruction. So I want to begin with some broad description, rather, of the neo-republican. Some broad description of the neo-republican theoretical claims, which I suspect won't be familiar to an audience of historians, but maybe. Republicanism, as you know, has any number of historical definitions, ranging from kind of civic humanism through kind of a constitutional hostility to monarchy. But the republicanism of Pettit and Skinner that I'm going to talk about today is different. It's not really a constitutional tradition, but rather it's a definition of liberty, a particular definition of liberty. Republican liberty in this sense positions itself between the famed poles of positive and negative liberty developed by Isaiah Berlin most famously. According to this Berlinian model, liberty can either be understood as negative freedom, a freedom from interference, a right to self-sovereignty and to individual end setting that is checked only by the rights of others, or it can be understood positively as a freedom to flourish in some normatively defined way, a freedom to flourish according to a rightly ordered hierarchy of goods and virtues. The Republican school I want to talk about today seeks to escape this polarization and to offer a third definition of liberty. They have offered us what they style a non-domination or non-dependency definition of liberty. Pettit contrasts this non-domination liberty with liberal non-interference liberty. That's their main foil. And I'm going to put up a few bullet points to kind of, as I talk this through, you can kind of see because it can get rather complicated, but see the contrast on the page here. Pettit writes that non-interference liberty, a kind of negative liberty, would say that to be free from interference, quote, is simply to lack interference as such, that is, to enjoy the absence of interference. But that non-domination liberty, and here I'm quoting, would say that the absence of interference is not enough. What is also necessary is that the agent be protected against interference, that she be given guarantees which help to ensure against interference. Liberty, in other words, cannot just be an absence of interference, but has to be the secure enjoyment of such an absence. An enjoyment that is not dependent, and this is the critical point, on the arbitrary will of a superior. The conditions of liberty are as important as its presence or absence, according to this definition. Liberty cannot exist at the sufferance or grace of superiors, but must be secure, and the mere threat of arbitrary government will turn some forms of apparent liberty, and here they have in mind the kind of liberty you might enjoy under an absolute despot or an enlightened despot, into unfreedom. So domination in this telling is defined as the mere existence of a power of interference on an arbitrary basis, whether or not there's any actual interference. Now, the reevaluation envisioned here operates in two directions. On the one hand, it considers as unfree any dominated individual, no matter how expansive the scope of non-interference they may enjoy is. And on the other hand, it considers as free any individual who may be subject to interference, actually, by the law, as long as the law is promulgated by a non-arbitrary superior, usually a democratic superior in this account, and the goal of the interference is to minimize domination broadly. So Pettit has characterized this as a contrast between a quantity notion of liberty and a quality notion of liberty. A liberal might, for instance, survey a market economy and pronounce a high quantity of liberty. Everybody has the liberty to be a millionaire. This is a kind of a reductio ad absurdum argument. A Republican would counter with a quality definition of liberty and pronounce this liberty of the market an ersatz liberty because of conditions of dependency and poverty and domination. You can imagine similar kind of disputes on questions of free speech in a market economy and so forth, and on and on. The debates kind of fall along these lines. In Pettit's telling, the non-interference account of liberty, the liberal account, if you will, strikes a negative view of the law and the state, both of which function necessarily often, but inevitably, to limit liberty only. The Republican understanding of liberty as non-domination sees well-designed laws and a just state as guarantors of liberty, as a quality control for our liberty. Liberalism, Pettit writes, which he associates with non-interference liberty, has been indifferent to the power of domination and, quote, tolerant of relationships in the home, in the workplace, and in the electorate, and elsewhere, that the Republican must denounce as paradigms of domination and unfreedom. Now, the Republicans insist that this is not a positive definition of liberty. Some people have said, well, this implies a kind of valorization of political participation, which is reminiscent of civic humanism and so forth. They deny this. They claim they are offering a negative account of liberty, a different version of negative liberty, in that individuals still set their own ends, they still have privacy, they still have their own comprehensive doctrines and so forth. What they are saying is they are offering an understanding of liberty which more securely protects negative freedoms. Now, this account of liberty has been subject to various theoretical critiques. One of them I just mentioned is a suggestion that it has a kind of valorization of civic activism lurking beneath it. But what interests me today is the historical case made by the neo-Republicans for an actual existing Republican tradition of non-domination accounts of liberty in history. The notion of republicanism and liberalism in sort of primal struggle is a morality tale that's very durable in our understanding of Western political thought. And what I want to ask today is how well this particular version of that struggle holds up, privileging as it does questions of these two definitions of liberty. Now, in some sense, this is Quentin Skinner's question rather than Philip Pettit's. Skinner is committed to the value of contextualizing political theory. A couple of quotes for you to mull over as I give this part of the talk. To historicism as a discipline of mind. By studying the diversity of the past, he argues, we rebuke our own operative assumptions and excavate long-buried possibilities of political activity. If a non-domination account of liberty is, by contrast, Skinner says, tendentiously extracted from a partial history or imposed upon history as a false coherence, then historical reasoning has become instrumental towards some ideological end. He writes, if we allow ourselves to approach the past with a less importunate sense of relevance, we may find our studies taking on a relevance of a different and more authentic kind. We may find in particular that the acquisition of an historical perspective helps us to stand back from some of our current assumptions and habits of thought and perhaps even to reconsider them. So that's Skinner. Pettit, by contrast, is much more blasé about historical method. He writes, historians define traditions, unify them. Individuals are selected as representative and exemplars of the traditions on a variety of incidental bases. One basis may be the figures acknowledged as heroes or anti-heroes, another texts taken as authoritative or heretical, yet another the events depicted as heroic or tragic, and such grounds, Pettit concludes disapprovingly, may be given more importance than the content of the claims themselves. It's thus Skinner, rather than Pettit, I think, who has the most to lose when historians challenge the coherence of any supposed non-domination account of liberty moving through history. One wonders indeed why Pettit feels the need to argue historically, as he does in his books, why he wants to locate non-domination historically as a Republican tradition. His desire may be partly linked to his desire to make republicanism a new public philosophy, complete with rhetorically compelling appeals to tradition. He often speaks in these terms. So he may view this as a rhetorical strategy. But one also suspects that he's committed to one particular historical claim, actually. He's very invested in the notion that non-interference accounts of liberty, the sort of Berlinian negative liberty, was a theory of liberty spawned in the service of market capitalism. He sees the metaphors of market and rational choice suffusing this kind of logic. And so he wants to find non-interference emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries alongside market capitalism. But whatever his reasons, he has often tried to have it both ways, appealing to history for rhetorical force while brushing off what he calls bulky historians, and asserting that his claims are not, quote, essentially tied to many controversial theses in the history of ideas, which he describes as detailed sorts of questions. But obviously, in this room at least, this won't do. The force of his understanding of liberty in some sense relies upon his historical claims about it. He assures us that Republican ideas of liberty are not, quote, newfangled notions, that they informed our democratic experience, our democratic institutions. So he's in some sense trying to benefit from Skinner's method for rebuking our ingrained liberal assumptions without committing himself to the discipline of mind that historical understanding requires. He writes at one point that, quote, all I strictly need to claim is that the representation of freedom as immunity from arbitrary control is found in many historical authors, that it is distinctive and challenging, and that it is worthy of consideration in contemporary political philosophy. And he concedes that history may be, quote, a series of simplifications that are justified only by the color that they give to my philosophical claims. This is not a historical method. To anyone committed to the value of historical knowledge, it's unacceptable, in fact. Historical lineage is not some honorific that we bestow upon our current prejudices. And I hope to show in this paper that a more fixed and precise account of the history of non-domination accounts of liberty does not provide the easy, comfortable storehouse of useful notions that Pettit thinks he has at his disposal. And Skinner is implicated in this to some extent as well, despite his more serious historical methods. Now, for both Skinner and Pettit, Leviathan functions very critically as a foil of the non-domination tradition. It was Hobbes who first formulated the novelty of a non-interference account of liberty. I've given some famous quotations from chapter 21 where Hobbes talks about civil liberty. Hobbes defined freedom as the mere absence of physical constraint, literally physical constraint. The will, he said, was like free-flowing water, free to travel where the determined impulses of appetite and aversion took it, and where dams did not hinder it. In civil terms, in terms of civil freedom, only physical constraint constituted an actual limitation of liberty, chains, jails. Even fear or terror, and this allowed did not constitute a restraint upon liberty, and this allowed Hobbes to construe a social contract as free, even if it was agreed to at the point of a gun. Freedom and necessity, according to Hobbes, were compatible. Absent chains, laws never violate liberty. One retains, in all circumstances, the right to violate the law, and one's mere fear of consequences does not constitute a restraint upon one's liberty. Hobbes offered, in other words, a lot could be said about this, but he offers a truly dramatic reduction of civil liberty to non-interference in a very bare form, literally seeing interference only defined as kind of physical restraint, and the Republicans concede that this later gets expanded somewhat in the liberal tradition, but nevertheless they see the kind of original sin here of Hobbes' definition. Now, as an analysis of Hobbes, there's a lot to commend here, and I think it's interesting that the Republicans' historical reconstruction has been most influential as an interpretation of these negative presences. So Hobbes, their interpretation of Paley and Bentham, utilitarians in Berlin, has been quite astute. But the positive dimensions of their historical account, their effort to find a Republican tradition opposite this, have been far less successful, in my opinion. They want to find this running from the ancients, through the Renaissance, to the English Civil War, to the American Revolution, and then it kind of peters out in the 19th century. They lose interest. Their view is that a Republican tradition in this very familiar territory, around their notion of liberty, was only supplanted by a non-interference account of liberty as market capitalism began to crowd out this older definition. And it's in this effort to find a positive tradition of non-dom, as they call it, somewhat cloyingly, that I would like to investigate in the remainder of this paper, because I think there are a lot of historical failures here. Now, in exploring the history of political thought on behalf of the neo-Republicans, we must seek specific debates, I think, in which a non-domination account of liberty is an explicit and argued out position. We must find in these debates a concern about the conditions of liberty, not just its existence, and not the end to which liberty is put. And specifically what we are seeking is an overriding concern with the mere possibility of arbitrary interference, even in the absence of a specific interference. So we would hope to see political actors actually ideally spurning a proffered liberty, because the conditions of that liberty were not sufficiently secure. The quality of a liberty privileged over its quantity. A freedom from the law spurned because it's not a freedom through the law. Now, the political theory of the 17th century is absolutely fundamental in this account because it elicits Hobbes' famous non-interference account of liberty, supposedly in dialogue with the Republicans' non-domination account. And their basic claim is that the parliamentarian struggle against Charles I, excuse the very undergraduate sort of looking slide, but there's a few dates in case you've forgotten, and an etching of the beheading of Charles I. Blood spurting out and everything. They basically claim that the parliamentary struggle to restrain the prerogatives of Charles I and then the Republican effort to justify his execution is the locus of much of this non-domination account of liberty. I have critiqued this elsewhere, and I'm not going to belabor this, but basically they're wrong about this. If you look at the political theory of the Civil War, you can find phrases here and there, and Skinner's very good at plucking these out of the texts. But basically, it's very difficult to find a political dispute, any given political struggle during the Civil War, which was oriented around the question, A, of negative freedoms for individuals, which is critical. They can't attach themselves to Milton's cause of a godly republic and so forth, because that's a positive account of liberty. That's out of bounds for them. And most Republicans, in fact, at this time, do have a positive notion of liberty, which is one of the problems they have to escape. You can find some demands for what we would call negative liberty in this period. So the levelers, for instance, demand access to the professions and pretty much a complete open market of free speech and so forth. But there, it's difficult to find a privileging of the conditions of the liberty over the mere winning of the privilege. I'll give you one example of this. Skinner makes great play of the effort by the Long Parliament to wrest control of the militia from Charles I. And he views this as an attempt to establish democratic control over military power. And in fact, the Long Parliament does assert control of the militia. He reads a lot of non-domination liberty language into this. The problem is, if you look at what actually happens in the Civil War, is that the Long Parliament takes control of the militia for 20 years. Not because they're worried about prerogative or interference, but because they're worried about a specific monarch and a specific act of interference. Once Charles I is dead or in his dotage, he can have control of the militia back. So it's almost a perfect encapsulation of concern about an actual interference that's rather indifferent to the conditions of potential interference. And on you can go with this. I mean, there's almost a perverse misreading of a lot of the political debates of the Civil War that animated the Republicans, either attempting to make Republicans into people asserting negative liberties for individuals, or misreading this question of the potential for arbitrary power and, as against a mere case of ill-considered interference. What I'm going to submit, so I think a lot of the case studies that they make of republicanism in the 17th century don't work, is the upshot. What I'm going to suggest is that there is one debate in the 17th century where the non-domination account of liberty is foregrounded. Remarkably so, in fact, and that is the debate about religious toleration, which roiled not so much the Civil War and interregnum, but more the Restoration post-1660 of the Stuart dynasty. In this debate, which is completely ignored by Skinner and Pettit for reasons I'll get to, we find a major public controversy in which their own account of liberty was constantly implicated. There is a great deal that could be said about toleration and its history in this period, and I can only make a few remarks here. The Revolution obviously witnessed an explosion of religious pluralism, and in some sense it animated the cause of individual religious freedom. But for all but the most radical of thinkers during this period, toleration was not an effort to secure a regime of public neutrality and expansive toleration. It was instead, typically in the 40s and 50s, an effort to secure free conscience, free religious seeking, for a very narrowly defined set of Protestants. Toleration, in a sense, as against free conscience, remained a pejorative term, denoting the toleration of evil, an act of prudence. Medieval canonists had developed the term and the thinking about toleration in precisely this way. The concept of toleration did not entail public neutrality or relativism, but instead it depended upon a sharply defined hierarchy of goods. You tolerated one evil to prevent a worse evil. You can find, for instance, throughout the Middle Ages and early modern period, toleration of prostitution justified along the lines that it's less of an evil than rape or, in their terms, sodomy. Toleration of Jews might be similarly justified as a better outcome than the massacre of Jews or the expulsion of Jews. So most efforts to secure some individual religious freedom during the years of the Civil War were not even tolerationist in this sense. They were instead efforts to secure free conscience for a very narrowly defined group of Protestants, and Catholics, Anglicans, Quakers, Socinians, and so forth were not included in this group. Well, Quakers, somewhat ambiguous. So paradoxically, it is not until the Restoration of 1660, an era associated with the return of absolutism, throne and altar politics, and so forth, that you begin to get the first sustained efforts to establish a tolerationist regime properly understood, some toleration of religious others who are not simply seeking the religious truth within a kind of acceptable boundary of hermeneutics. Both of the later Stuart dynasts, Charles II and his brother James II, pursued a much broader regime of toleration that went well beyond these notions of free conscience. These policies of indulgence, as they were known, would have extended to Catholics, to Protestant nonconformists, and even to groups like Quakers. They did not extend to atheists or blasphemers and so forth, but nevertheless, they did extend to Jews and Muslims in certain versions. These efforts were efforts to extend toleration to all Christians and even all monotheists, and didn't require an expansive notion of free conscience. They did seem to implicate some notion of public neutrality. In other words, you're tolerating people you consider irredeemably evil, papists, religious enthusiasts of a madcap variety, and so forth. This is not a kind of common seeking of the truth, as free conscience might have been construed. Now, for their part, of course, now it's a great irony in some sense to many Whiggish historians that the Stuarts pursue this and they're resisted vigorously by Parliament. Parliament was very Anglican after the Restoration and resisted most of these efforts. The Stuarts pursued them, partly, it must be said, because both men were Catholics. Charles II was a secret Catholic and James II an open one. And they were thus driven to succor their co-religionists in some respects. But they were also concerned about the political implications of religious repression. They were concerned about re-triggering the Civil War, so they wanted to use this to pacify the body politic, if you will. So there are two kind of notions here. For our purposes, the key point is that these policies were pursued through declarations of indulgence. These were published in England, and there were some published in Scotland as well. These declarations varied somewhat, but they usually suspended aspects of the penal laws, which have been updated at the Restoration to ensure Anglican conformity. So these are laws against Catholics, they're laws against Protestant nonconformists, there are a whole variety of them They did everything from force you to take an oath against transubstantiation to prevent you from coming within 5 miles of a town. They kept you out of course, church livings, but also kept you out of parliament, out of local office holding, and so forth. There were a whole series of them I won't get into. The Stuart Declarations basically suspended these, or attempted to. And I'm going to quote the effort of 1662. They attempted to succor those who, quote, living peaceably do not conform thereunto, through scruple and tenderness of misguided conscience, note misguided conscience, but modestly and without scandal perform their devotions in their own way. Typically, these declarations did promise to incline the wisdom of Parliament, as Charles II said, to give a law of indulgence, but in the absence of such a law, the royal supremacy in the church would be used to assert an edict of indulgence. They limited this indulgence if religious dissent tipped into political dissent. But otherwise, they presented dissenters as wayward lambs, harmless. They tended to evoke the loyalism of the Catholics during the Civil War and so forth. So there was an effort to minimize this political threat. They typically authorized Catholics to worship only in private homes, but allowed for more open worship by Protestant dissenters, provided they applied for and received a license. Now, opposition to these declarations was partly based upon opposition to the very end, not the means itself, but the end. So in Parliament, you have a predominant of high church Anglican opinion during this period. They don't want toleration, and they force the king to retract these. Most of these come to grief. In fact, all of them come to grief. Charles is forced to withdraw his, and as many of you will know, James's effort at this plays a major role in the downfall of his government, because the bishops of the church, who in other respects are high monarchists, refuse to read the declaration or order it to be read from the pulpits. They are, in fact, tried for this and become very unlikely heroes of the Glorious Revolution for their resistance to James II. But they're almost perfect encapsulation of the opposite of a non-domination account of liberty. They're disappointed in the unenlightened qualities of the despot that they in other respects completely support. So a lot of the opposition to these declarations is this sort of opposition. They're just an opposition to this disastrous mismanagement of the church. And you get here the irony of a Catholic dynasty having royal supremacy over the Church of England and the tensions that produces. However, a major faction opposing these declarations was in fact dissenters themselves. Occasionally Catholics, but more often nonconformist Protestants. And these nonconformists were in a position to benefit from the indulgence. They saw religious freedom as an essential political end. They yearned for it in ways we can only imagine. But they refused to accept it as a gift or favor. These dissenters argued about the indulgence in ways that very closely map onto the Republican notion of real liberty, as liberty enjoyed outside of conditions of domination. And this is the only 17th century political debate that I know in which this is the major stream of argument among a major faction. The evidence for this is thick on the ground, and I'm just going to go through a few examples of this to give you some sense. It emerges somewhat in the parliamentary debates about the declarations. You do find this position espoused, concern about law and the violation of law and the prerogative of this, even among people who support indulgence or toleration. But there, largely opposition to the indulgence prevailed, and so you don't find it so much in the parliamentary debates. It's more among the pamphlets that are produced by dissenters. They begin to find a kind of increasingly common use of this kind of argument. For instance, in 1663, after the first indulgence, a tract appeared entitled "One Word More, or the Plain English of Indulgence." This was a faux dialogue between two characters named Orthodox and Nonconformist. It's a ripping good read. It attempted to buttress the House of Commons as it fought Charles II's effort at an indulgence. And it offered a standard sort of set to against tolerationist arguments. It wasn't going to improve trade, blah, blah, blah. But one of its most sustained arguments derided nonconformists for posturing as defenders of Parliament against absolutism while accepting toleration as a gift of prerogative. Charles, Orthodox notes, had asked for a law of indulgence, but, quote, "If Parliament, who represent the people, shall not think fit in their great wisdom to offer His Majesty anything of that nature, His Majesty cannot help it, unless you would have him do what you so often declared against his father for." That is, not only govern contrary to his own conscience, but contrary to his own law, his parliament's advice, and the great constitutions of his government. Nonconformist, the toleration desirer, was forced to confess that the king's tenderness was, quote, not to allow a dispensation of established laws in their behalf without the advice of his great council, parliament assembled. So the nonconformist was put on his back heel over this. But Orthodox is relentless in suggesting that the dissenters had worked upon the king's goodness with importunities and acted as sycophants and flatterers. Effectively, dissenters, it said, had traded their old bondage for a new kind of slavery and servility. The dynamics of indulgence in this way introduced a new dimension into critiques of toleration. Traditionally, anti-tolerationists had argued that those desiring toleration were placing religion beyond the reach of the state, that they were in a sense kind of species of papists, that they didn't want the government running religion, and thus they were seditious. But once prerogative power after the Restoration swings behind the cause of toleration, you need to find new arguments. And what Orthodox parties developed was the notion that dissenters had become slaves and abettors of an absolute power. And this was a charge with sting, given that many of these figures had been involved in the opposition to the Stuarts during the Civil War. Thus, the famous nonconformist Richard Baxter could publish against Charles's 1662 indulgence by writing that "'Tis toleration which you endeavour to set up by proclamation, and this cannot be done without a parliament, unless your majesty will let your subjects see that you will take unto yourself a liberty thrown down from the laws of the land at your pleasure." Of the dissenters who were more inclined to accept the indulgence, and we'd get a split among dissenters on this question, nevertheless struggled with this point. An indulgence, wrote one, was necessary, an act of clemency, and it would emit from the inclinations of a single man. Those who desired indulgence must jointly cast their expectations and desires onto a dependency upon His Majesty. So we see the language of dependency either critiqued or accepted, the force of necessity being the basic argument. This is the very definition of a dependency model of liberty as non-interference. And to many dissenters, that was unacceptable. You find a lot of resistance to this, particularly in Scotland, where the king's authority over the church was taken as a kind of Erastian affront from England, but I won't get into that nuance of the question. The position of the Stuarts as Catholic monarchs armed with the royal supremacy, who nevertheless headed a Protestant church, raised for all Britons the dangers of dependency on arbitrary power. For traditional monarchical Anglicans, the danger was that Charles II or James II would betray the church. And James II in particular became very crude in telegraphing this possibility. He said to Archbishop Sancroft, he's playing for support for Catholic toleration, basically, trying to get the established church to give him support, or turning to the dissenters if he must. He said to Archbishop Sancroft, "I will keep my word and undertake nothing against the religion which is established by law, unless you first break your word to me. But if you do not do your duty to me, i.e. tolerate Catholicism, do not expect that I shall protect you. You should be made sure that I shall find means to do my business without you." This brazen flaunting of power led the bishops to drift from the traditional deference to the monarchy, as I've suggested. "If we exalt the king's prerogative above the law," wrote Bishop Compton of London, specifically of James II's desire to dispense with the penal laws, "we do as good to tell people that the king may ravish their wives, spoil their goods, and cut their throats at pleasure." So even these Anglicans could adopt this language, although it was quite instrumental in their case. For dissenters, this concern was even more real because it mapped onto their traditional politics. And they often showed their resistance by refusing to take part in what were highly organized addresses of thanks to the king for his indulgences. So the king would go out and say, "Well, we'd like to have some addresses of thanks. Could you organize these?" And these were seen as particular marks of servility, particular evidence that only a supplicant or only a slave could enjoy the freedom as envisioned by these indulgences. Of this resistance, one observer wrote, quote, "The dissenters who are wise and considering are sensible of the snare themselves, and though they desire ease and liberty, they are not willing to have it with such apparent of hazard to church and state. And I am sure that though we should be so desirous that they might have their liberty," this is a kind of favorable tolerationist, "we cannot consent that they should have it this way, which they will find the dearest liberty that was ever granted." This is almost a perfect encapsulation of non-domination accounts of individual liberty. The Whiggish Bishop John Burnet put it this way in opposing James II's indulgence. The dissenters, for a little present ease, to be enjoyed at mercy, must concur to break down all our hedges, and lay us open to that devouring power, before which nothing can stand that will not worship it. The public liberty of Magna Carta and other protections against slavery could not survive such dependence upon prerogative, he wrote. Another example, a dissenting voice this time, named Oliver Heywood. Though the dissenters had liberty promised, we knew it was not out of love for us, but for another purpose. We heard the king had said it was forced to grant liberty. We heard the king had said that he had been forced to grant liberty at present to those whom his soul abhorred. Would James, demanded another pamphlet, be for liberty any longer than it serves his turn? And great polemical use was made about the revocation of the Edict of Nantes as a perfect example of how toleration at prerogative will might fail. Now, all this put enormous pressures on conforming defenders of indulgence. The concern about the royal supremacy as a threat to Parliament in this instance, but also a threat to real spiritual independence, were concerns that intermingled. Critics of indulgence questioned, however, whether the noble end of toleration might be, however noble the end of toleration might be, indulgence nevertheless had been, quote, tendered upon such conditions as may involve the acceptors of it thereof in guilt of much sin. So you also get a language of sin and of falling from kind of true conscience and true religion, not just kind of parliamentary language here. It's interesting how they intermingle. The indulgence, they said, was fool's gold, a straightening rather than an enlargement of real Christian liberty. It removed interference but put recipients of favor on bended knee, subject to the cognizance and inspection of our enemies, and the requirement of licensing was often identified here. Liable to the king's censures. By accepting a license, wrote one, we give the king an arbitrary power, acknowledge he may dispense with old laws for my pretended good and advantage, and make new. For by the same rule that he may make a new law for my pretended good and advantage, he may make another for my real hurt. This dependency on arbitrary power, this specious freedom, thus threatened both Christian liberty and liberty's civil or our civil rights. And you do begin to find that phrase, our civil rights, appearing. Really, one of the first debates you find that clearly. Now, defenders of indulgence rejected this concern, and they tended to suggest that necessity and the Anglicans' ill will had put them in this position. For my conscience and religion, wrote one, is my duty. And whoever gives me the opportunity to discharge that duty, be it a Turk or a foreign conqueror, I will, through grace, do my duty, though I own not their authority. So, in a sense, these voices played the arbitrary and capricious nature of the official church against the dangers of monarchical absolutism. They could be quite clever in sort of turning these arguments against the established church. But the feeling ran very deep among some dissenters that even rights of conscience could not override existing law, or that conscience was in some sense violated by accepting it on these terms. One of the most famous, and the Anglicans were absolutely pitiless in making the dependence on Catholics clear. And here they used all sorts of evocations of Catholic indulgences and what that implied spiritually and so forth. So there's a lot of allusions to the Reformation and Catholic indulgences and so forth. The most effective, deadly effective, Anglican tract produced during this period to oppose dissenting efforts to get toleration was produced by the Marquis of Halifax, known as the Great Trimmer for his political convictions. In 1687, a tract called A Letter to a Dissenter. This short pamphlet, and this is the last example I'm going to give you, became one of the printing wonders of the age, circulating by the thousands during the run-up to the Glorious Revolution. It really was a very influential tract. It triggered an enormous pamphlet war, actually, back and forth, but its own arguments proved crucial in steeling dissenter opposition to James II, despite the indulgence. It warned darkly that dissenters could not trust their new friends. The other day you were the sons of Satan, Halifax wrote. Now you are the angels of light. If the Church of England, Halifax warned the dissenters, which had resisted James II, but gave him a smile or a glimpse of compliance in his Catholicizing ends, the king would turn the royal thunder upon your heads and blow you off the stage with a breath. The indulgence was designed to bring in popery, and then it would be withdrawn for Protestants. And it could be withdrawn because of its conditions. Quote, "The desire of enjoying a liberty from which men have been so long restrained may be a temptation that reason is not at all times able to resist. In such a case, some objections are leapt over. But where to recuse yourself from the severity of one law, you give a blow to all laws, by which your religion and your liberty are to be protected. You look like counsel retained by prerogative against your old friend Magna Carta. The price expected of you for this liberty is giving up your rights in the laws. Now that you have for some time enjoyed the benefit of the end, it is time for you to look into the danger of the means. For this pretended liberty of conscience, your real freedom is to be sacrificed." I've quoted this at some length because these phrases are almost directly out of the neo-republican case. Rights in the law, real freedom, enslavement, and so forth, ends versus means. At no point in their reconstruction of the Civil War and the debates around Charles I's prerogatives did the pedants going to come up with anything like this kind of sustained language of non-dependence. Now, I've only been able to sketch out the broad debate here. Just a few concluding words. What I'm trying to argue in the book is that you begin to get an increasing tempo of this concern as the Restoration wears on. With the first indulgence, there's quite a bit of dissenting support. In the heady days of the Restoration, there's a lot of royalism around. This is a very effective way to argue for toleration. Our great king, returned from exile, wants to tolerate. By the time you get to James II, partly because of the increasing Catholic profile of the Stuarts, these arguments are much less common, and you begin to get much more dissenting resistance. And partly what I'm trying to do in the book is to locate Locke's evolution from anti-tolerationism in his youth to a kind of prerogative tolerationism in the 1660s to what we would understand as a more rights-oriented account of religious toleration in the 1680s. Try to locate it within this context of dissenting concern about non-dominating liberties and so forth. So I'm attempting, not in this talk, but in the broader book, to contextualize Locke's evolutions in this respect, and to, in some sense, ask the question where it is that our notion of individual rights come from, in some sense. By which I mean individual rights defined as notions of self-sovereignty. Not as the right to behave rightly according to some natural law, but a right to, absent the constraint of other people's rights, to execute full self-sovereignty in various areas of our life. Now, there are a lot of answers to this question, but most accounts of rights have privileged religious toleration as a kind of original site of this kind of thinking. There are other sites of it, concerns about property and so forth. But if you look, for instance, at most political theorists, Rawls is very casual in asserting this. That the story of rights that he wants to tell and the rights history that he wants to perfect is found in the wars of religion, the Restoration, the Reformation, and the effort to establish free conscience. But this is often just tossed off as a kind of Whiggish tale. And I think it's important to dig down into the details of it, how it happens, when it happens, under what circumstances. And I think my case would be that an important dimension of it, as defined by current debates in political theory, emerges in this period. And so this is the case that I'm trying to make in this talk and in my broader book. Now, this raises a final question that I'll consider before concluding, and that is, did these findings have any significance for the Republican project? I'm often asked this. Might not the neo-Republicans just pat me on the head, say, "Thank you, historian. You found yet another cite of this language. We'll incorporate this in our next edition." Or do these historical lessons perhaps offer us some reason to pause about their overall political project, which is mobilizing a mythology that I don't think can be sustained? Pettit, I suspect, would say, it's fine with me, throw it into the hopper. He's not very invested, as I've suggested, in the notion that historical detail provides any sort of, it does any kind of important work for the political theorist. But as I've also suggested, I don't think that quite does. I think he is invested in the notion that it is market logic, rational choice, individual consumption that generate the market, if you will, for this kind of non-interference language, which supplants non-domination language. In other words, it's only when we become increasingly apolitical in the 18th century, increasingly hived off into civil society and a world of markets and consumption, that our political language can kind of cringe before enlightened despotism, however dressed up it is as a constitutional order, as in England. And so we get the subservient, servile, capitalist subject of liberalism. And, well, I'm not saying I've completely disallowed this as a part of the story. And it is interesting that in the 19th century, you do begin to get a resurgence of this language among guilds and labor unions about the conditions of liberty. I mean, that's another interesting cite for this. Nevertheless, I think it is important that he thinks we've been duped, in a sense, by the language of political economy into accepting this notion of liberty. And I don't think my account is completely consistent with this, both either chronologically or substantively. But equally, and this is the final point, Pettit would not, in my view, and nor Skinner, be sympathetic to the idea that non-domination accounts of liberty were first and most vigorously espoused by religious tolerationists and dissenters, who were by and large deeply committed Christians. Pettit famously, and I quoted this a little bit at the start, but there's a lot more that can be said, seeks to eradicate domination not just in the state, but also in society, in families, in civil associational life, and in churches. The state and the sovereign must act as an instrument fighting domination in all respects. In this sense, he's a very statist kind of theorist. He believes in law and the state as a kind of force for advancement, as against libertarians who think the state is always interfering in people's liberties. As long as the law performs this function of minimizing domination, its intrusions, no matter how coercive they may appear, are legitimate, and they cannot be cast as unfree. In fact, they may be expanding freedom of a certain kind. There is a really robust statism that lurks behind this perspective, an assumption that sovereignty, if properly designed, can serve the ultimate end of empowering individuals with real freedom. And though he's often rather cagey about specific policies in his writing, I think because he doesn't want to get into culture wars and so forth, one can see how this notion of sovereignty might be used to justify pretty robust regulation of families and civic associations and even of religious institutions. There's a kind of perfectionist liberalism at the root of this, I think. Families and churches, indeed, might be the most commonly cited sources of the kind of social domination that just states must target for eradication. It would thus be historically inconvenient, and perhaps suggestive in inconvenient ways, to concede that dissenters and tolerationists were the primary defenders of a non-domination account of liberty in the 17th century. That dissenters feared state domination alone. Their entire ethical worldview, most of them, not all of them, otherwise made them utterly accepting of dependence and domination by the will of others. The details of Christian theology, of original sin, of divine omnipotence, of grace, of the spiritual authority of the church, be it visible or invisible, these generated an overwhelming sense of dependence for most Christians, and continue to, within their churches and within their families. And for these dissenters, the dangers of arbitrary will were largely manifested by the emerging modern state, with its new logic of scientific sovereignty. That a non-domination account of liberty might have worked primarily to critique the arbitrary power of this sovereign state as it emerged, while conserving the considerable autonomy of non-state, social, and familial institutions, is not something, I think, that will be easily integrated into a neo-republican mythology. That's it. We'll take questions if you have. People have any? Yeah, Ben.
After James II flees England and the negotiations of what to do happens, William of Orange, do these debates, do they play a role? Because William's a Protestant king. So
Right.
is it viewed differently that a Protestant king would grant toleration to just Protestants? Does that change the...
Yeah. Now, a couple of points to make about this. One, the toleration was not just extended to Protestants, or even just to Christians. And we can talk about a dimension of it, because there's a kind of side debate about Muslims and Jews, which is interesting. And he comes from, of course, the Dutch Republic, where he has tends toward a much more tolerationist view, and of course their suspicions are lower. But the suspicions of the established church are not lower. Of course, most of these guys are on their way out as non-jurors who refuse to take oaths of allegiance to William, because though they oppose James in his style of rule and his Catholic policies for the church, they are divine writers as regards hereditary succession. So this is the oddity of these Anglican. So within the church, there's a lot of concern about William, who is, of course, not a communicating Anglican by birth. He becomes one. But all of this, of course, is supplanted fairly quickly by the Act of Toleration, which sets different terms of toleration for Protestants, basically. And you get a preservation of the anti-Catholic regulations. And, of course, there's no toleration of atheism. There's a new blasphemy act in the 1690s and so forth. So there persist kind of prerogative tolerations in some corners. So the Jews are only tolerated in England out of prerogative until the 19th century. There's an effort in the 18th century to regularize their position, but it comes to grief amidst all sorts of anti-Semitic rioting and so forth. So there are still important dimensions of prerogative toleration right through the Enlightenment, but toleration among Christians is increasingly regulated by the law and by demands to remove the remaining legal restrictions on Protestants and, in some circumstances, on Catholics. So it does change the dimensions of the debate considerably. And Locke finds himself, for instance, as he writes the various versions of his letter on toleration. The first letter, there are 4 letters, as most of you know. The first letter is written in 1685 and is full-blown against the Stuarts, and this language is grist to its mill and so forth. The latter letters are written after the Glorious Revolution, and so he finds himself much more flat-footed. He has to defend in some sense, though it's imperfect, the Act of Toleration. It's an example of how it changed some of the rhetorical force of the debates and so forth, but I don't think fundamentally undermines these concerns, which have in some sense triumphed by using legislation to get toleration through. Erin?
Yeah, I'm going to struggle to formulate this because, sort of from the beginning of your talk to the end, I'm thinking, the final version of Locke's letter on toleration. Yeah. But there, and I think this is a relational, as you've described it, not just between the confession of the ruling dynasty and the opposition, the Anglican Church, but also the moving target of what is despotism. Yeah. And how the despot, by replacing the Stuarts in Locke's final letter is the Turk.
Yeah.
And that language, not just as rhetoric, but also as a longer-term notion linked with the opposition to a republicanism located in Venice, and a defense of oligarchical privilege, and Magna Carta. Is there. So I'm wondering how those two, what you see those two functioning together.
Yeah.
Toleration and despotism, indulgence and despotism. Well, actually, indulgence and despotism would probably be the more, or prerogative of despotism, more appropriate relationship.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. And of course, the later Locke develops a kind of notably serviceable attitude towards the English state. He serves on all sorts of boards. He serves on the Board of Trade. He advises various aristocrats. He's rather deeply involved in government. And in those settings, he doesn't really stand out as a great advocate of individual liberty. His initials are all over colonial documents, which are about the regulation of slavery and so forth. So, it is certainly true that, as with all of the Whigs and all of the opponents of the Stuarts, one has to grapple with this question of how much actual advocating of freedom and constitutionalism they represent, and how much they're just concerned about the Catholic profile of the Stuarts. This is a great paradox on both sides of the Restoration. And I basically, Mark Goldie's writing a book on Locke after the Glorious Revolution, which is almost an entirely neglected field. Once you get to the Glorious Revolution, he won, it's done. He becomes a kind of grandee of epistemology in the 18th century, and his political thought is boring to most people. But there's a lot interesting to say about that. And I generally agree with what you're suggesting, that and of course this ties into the great question of whether Locke's notion of freedom really attaches to individuals, or does it attach to heads of households and property of individuals. There are a lot of ways you could kind of probe that dimension of the question. The question of Islam is quite interesting, and how he uses Islamic powers in the world to, in the first letter he says that toleration should extend to peaceable Christians, pagans, Jews, and Muslims, Mohammedans, as he puts it, except the important exception of those loyal in a blind way to the Mufti of Constantinople, who fused religious loyalty and political loyalty in an unacceptable way. Now, how expansive that category would be, did Locke know the details of actual political allegiance as it operated in the Islamic world, is a hard question, but obviously there would be Muslims outside of that prohibition. And a lot of people read that as a kind of coded attack on Catholics, that the Mufti is the Pope, really. That's a very compelling reading, actually. If you look at a lot of the literature Locke was reading, the Mufti is sometimes described, for instance, as a circumcised Pope and so forth. I mean, there's a kind of fusion of those two.
Yeah, but he was reading Michael. So
Yeah, he was reading those too, and he was often accused, as were many people suspicious of the Trinity, of being someone who was kind of flirting with Islam. I mean, this is kind of over-the-top accusation in Locke's case, but he was a Socinian, and one of the common complaints against Socinians in the polemical debates of the late 17th century is that they're basically Islamicizing Christianity. So there's all sorts of dimensions to that question. He felt very vulnerable on that point, as a lot of anti-Trinitarians did. But he read a lot. He had the Quran, he knew the Quran pretty well. There are things in the letters about Muslims being sincere strivers towards morality and religious truth, but that they're in a context where they kind of, while it's certainly true that there are the kind of standard images of absolutism that he extracts from that history, there's another dimension to Locke on the question of Muslims and whether they should be tolerated and so forth, and likewise Jews. And they were, as I say, tolerated strictly through prerogative through this period. Edicts were issued tolerating the Jewish presence. There was a very small Muslim presence. It starts to increase towards the late 17th century and into the 18th century as the East India Company begins to bring some people in and so forth. But there are a lot of interesting questions. John Marshall's written quite a bit about this. But it sort of highlights the prerogative dimensions of this, because tolerationist discourse in the broader community very much distinguished heretics and schismatics within Christianity from non-Christians. There were very different questions that were raised. And the language of tolerating an evil or something that was hopelessly lost, it was easily applied to Muslims and Jews, whereas the threat of Christian heresy was too serious to tolerate, right? And so ironically, in some early modern discourse, you get more toleration towards non-Christians. And one of the strategies of toleration is to say, don't we Christians deserve at least as much toleration as these awful Muslims and Jews get? I mean, so you get a lot of conflicting themes in the tolerationist discourse as regards non-Christian religions, monotheistic religions, and even pagans in Locke's language. This referring to America largely. Other questions? Oh, yeah.
How directly and necessarily have you foreopened Berlin's negative positive liberties model? I was struck as you were talking that sort of negative liberties seem to have a kind of, that there weren't quotation marks around them, at least not the ones I could hear.
Yeah.
It's always hard to know when something's, so I'm wondering how much you still adhere to a Berlinian model, and maybe you sort of talked about thought about what some people thought were underlying deep contradictions in that model, which on two sides, really, the negative liberty seems to be put forward without any due consideration of the preconditions and the context of negative liberty.
Yeah.
So that Berlin will sort of concede in some sort of parenthetical phrases that in negative liberty has its preconditions, but actually doesn't develop the point.
Yeah.
And then the other side is the sort of core incoherence of positive liberty in Berlin's account, which really he elides very different notions of positive liberty from self-direction and a share in the controlling authority, which seem to be relatively distinct notions of positive liberty that perhaps would have general assent among most liberals. And then the sort of dangerous, P2 version of positive liberty, which is a kind of utopian drive to make everyone conform to a teleological sense of what society should be. Yeah. And that's sort of like almost the Stalinist version of positive
colored
liberty.
by a totalitarian.
He tended rhetorically to see everyone who sort of is in favor of self-direction and a share in the controlling authority was sort of on that slippery slope to the Gulag. So could you just comment on how deeply Berlinian assumptions still structure?
Well, I think, I'm sympathetic to what you're suggesting, that this is these are basic kind of sloppy unit ideas that belong to a mid-20th century context where Rousseau is precursor to the Nazis and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of historical sloppiness to the notion, and I take your point that there's a lot of differentiation between people who he might describe. He's famous for this kind of categorization, which is so. I don't think much of Isaiah Berlin as an intellectual historian, and a lot of the criticism of this kind of use of Berlin is that they're using a straw man, that they're accepting his categorizations in an effort to kind of caricature, for capricious reasons, various thinkers and so forth. So Locke, for instance, it's ridiculous to suggest that Locke, who's a classic liberal, of course, or Constant, even more classic liberal, they were concerned about the conditions of liberty, of course. I mean, you're absolutely right. And likewise, it's hard to find, with Rousseau or Marx and so forth, people who are completely hostile to the notion of private end setting and so forth. So, I mean, I basically agree with you. And I suppose it's one way to attack the very notion of trying to carve out a kind of third tradition here. So to the extent that I was positioning them against it, it's their own positioning and not mine. Which is not to say that I don't think conceptually it's interesting to think about. One way of thinking about it more historically is to ask the question, when is it that rights go from things that might be liberties, or might be duties, but whatever they are structured around notions of rightly ordered action, to something more like rights as areas of self-sovereignty, which are only constrained by the self-sovereignty of others. So when is it you get a kind of logic of rights that we would recognize as liberal? If you think about it, that's another way of posing the question about telos and agency and individual end setting and so forth in the area of freedom, but it has more historical weight to it because it's located within scholastic debates about natural rights and so forth, and then the new US naturalism of the 17th century. But Berlin was most interested in the 19th and 20th centuries, and I would basically agree with you that the umbrella terms kind of really have a lot of holes in them. And we'll put to polemical uses, is what you're suggesting too, I think.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. Obviously the main concern seems to be kind of locating a dispute about religious freedom in how it reconfigures political language and political ideas. But I wondered about the other side of how these political disputes may have also generated different kind of ideas about, different kinds of religious ideas and identities from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly because you mentioned these accusations about Locke Islamizing Christianity. There's some kind of concern about the nature of his Christian orientation and its possible political, consequences are clearly at stake. So I wondered if you could maybe elaborate exactly what's at the heart of that, what they actually mean. But then secondly, it reminded me of this case of a relative contemporary, John Toland,
mm-hmm.
and his attempts actually, in a way, to create kind of toleration and political community, or at least accommodation of Muslims by Christianizing Islam. In the sense of saying, look, this is not the best, but certainly not the worst form of Christianity. Obviously the papists are the worst, but these guys are less bad than that. And so I just wondered
there's a fascinating example of that. In the 1680s, there was a vague attempt, and it's hard to pin down who actually did this, but Locke was aware of it, to convert the ambassador from Morocco to Socinianism by people that were around Shaftesbury. They gave him a memo about how you're close, but you need to kind of rationalize it a little more and to accept these Christian sources of revelation. And Locke himself was a conversionist towards the end of his life as regards to Jews, more clearly. And he believed in the resettlement of the Jews, the return of the Jews. He was a restorationist, but he also believed that they would convert to some form of rational Christianity. Whether he was a millenarian and these expectations weren't clear, it's always hard to tease this out of his notebooks. So, a lot of kind of favorable attitude towards Jews and Muslims could be, it has different valences if you look at it these ways. As for politics, do you mean geopolitics? Is this what you're asking about? Or this question that Ariel was making about the regime and its shape and so forth? I do think, I gave a kind of internal story here. any real story about this would have to have a lot to say about France, what was happening in France with the revocation. And this really cast prerogative toleration in a bad light. Also would have to talk a lot about Ireland and about the dangers that a freed Catholic population might become rebellious and seditious and cut all our throats again, as they did in the 40s. So there were geopolitics that pertain to it. You know, do I want to say something about Turkish push into Europe in the 80s and so forth, and whether this, you know, I have to confess I haven't mapped this on to the questions of East-West interactions to know whether you could say something interesting about whether Locke's views of the benignness, if you will, of Muslim religion and Muslim power rose and fell according to what they perceived to be the threat to Christianity that Muslim power posed. Certainly you get, I mean, there are lots of dimensions to the question of how Muslims are understood in these debates about religion. For Hobbes and for many like Henry Stubb, and even for people like Tolan, and here I would kind of push back on the tolerationist reading of Tolan. Islam was kind of useful because it was a better civil religion than Christianity. It was more properly suited to use religious authority to put curlicues, basically, and to veil raw political power. And in that sense, toleration of the exotic could be one way of being fairly coercive towards some internal enemies, namely clericalists and high churchmen and so forth, who had proven such a bane on English society and had helped trigger the Civil War and so forth by claiming real spiritual authority for the church. So Hobbes, for instance, has a few kind words about, he says very little about Muslims, but he has a few kind words about them, basically saying, well, look, this is a kind of noble lie and a well-designed one, as against Christianity, which was a terrible noble lie, which has made us all, you know, plagued by these priests and so forth and these superstitions. So I mean, I think that, you know, whether this is always a tolerationist discourse or whether sometimes it's a kind of useful stick to beat certain strands of Christianity with is another interesting question you can ask when you talk about these things. But I have a feeling I'm not getting quite to the politics point that you're asking. If you want to try to take another stab at it.
No,
Okay.
I was curious about, you said that in sort of labor disputes in the 19th century was another locus where you have this sort of debates about tolerance and non-domination. And I started thinking about sort of non-religious debates and about tolerance in the 17th century. And thinking about, you know, there's guilds and you have sort of doctors against midwives and different professions. And there's a real sense of expertise in the field, and the fact that it seems a lot of this religious tolerance, is there some, you know, how much is there a sense of superiority and in terms of expertise, and is there I don't know, it seems to me there's almost a tacit acknowledgement of a humanism there, kind of, that we are, you know, it does come down to belief, and there's not as much debate in terms of, you know, our religion is much better than yours going on. I don't hear that as much going on. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there seem to be two dimensions to your question. On the one hand, I mean, of course, individual liberty could be construed outside religious contexts, right? And one of them is certainly professional life. And you don't have to go to the 19th century or the 18th century to find this. In the 17th century, you can find the very much organizing against guild control of the printing trades and medicine and so forth. So certainly the move towards a kind of atomization of society and investment of individuals with rights of various kinds against corporate power, subsidiary powers. That move, as in religion, is both a move to empower individuals, but also one to empower the state as regulator of an increasingly atomized society. So I think it's a kind of liberal myth to simply valorize that. I mean, I think in some respects, this was the Hobbesian project, to leave us alone with state regulation and to remove all intermediary, subsidiary corporate powers, which, by the way, usefully removes any effective resistance to sovereignty, because individuals, what are they going to do? They're busy, you know, buying things and being doctors and, you know, praying in their homes and so forth. So, I mean, I would agree with your basic point that you could. Now, do you find the same language of dependence, non-domination? I don't think so. You do begin to find it in the 19th century as a pushback to laissez-faire accounts of economic freedom, you know, and the point being there that the conditions of this freedom are impossible. What good is this freedom to me when I can't organize, where my labor union is understood to be an illegal conspiracy and I'm fired at will and so forth? So the laws are in some sense It's not quite the same prerogative question, but it's a question of whether the laws as passed by Parliament and as decided by the common law courts had effectively set up a kind of false, expansive on the surface but meaningless inside kind of liberty. But that's a rather different question than accessing professions that are controlled by guilds. It's almost a kind of inversion of the question, right? Now, as far as ecumenical impulses and whether those sorts of things are at play in toleration, I mean, of course, yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of other, I'm not trying to offer a total history of toleration here. And religious pluralism itself is a brute political fact that people increasingly have to grapple with, right, within England. I mean, this is the first, the first time when the Restoration is really the first time when people have to confront, this is not about defining a single national church anymore. It's now about the possibility of that and what we're going to do. How are we going to live with this moral disagreement? So it might be ecumenical and syncretic among some intellectuals, certainly, and they tend to be people who are shedding aspects of the tradition, trying to find a common core, the religion of the nations, and so forth. But among a lot of people, it's, gee, I still believe all these dogmas in my own church. It's just, it's clear to me that we're going to have religious warfare endlessly if we don't come up with some modus vivendi. So I think, there are different strains there as regards coexistence and pluralism. But yeah. David?
This is probably a really naive question. I may just not have the background to fill in some gaps that you're sort of assuming, but it seems to me that Pettit and Skinner are primarily interested in the power of the power that non-state actors have over their subordinate non-state actors, if we can put it in those terms. Mm-hmm. That it's not at all, they're not really that worried. The question of non-domination is not, they're not talking about non-domination by the state or by the monarch. They're talking about non-domination by other people, and in fact, the idea that you can create a state and you can create laws that can protect the individual from that domination. Yeah. And so it seems to me implicit there is that there's a whole sort of, there's a critique of the idea of a liberal theory that posits the existence of an autonomous individual, when the reality, the lived reality of the world is much more a lived reality of patriarchalism, of pyramids, of power independence, right? So I'm trying to get how your example, your historical example, which is once again a debate about the power of the monarch, yeah, and not about the power of non-monarch individuals, how it really relates to the overall point that you're trying to make about Skinner and Pettit, when it yeah seems to me almost apples and oranges.
Well, I mean, this is kind of going to dance around this question at the conclusion of the talk. I mean, for one thing, I sometimes wonder about these kind of, I mean, okay, so they're not only saying, listen, everybody's, in some sense, who's a liberal and is interested in the rule of law is concerned about the power of private individuals over other private individuals. I mean, that's not something liberals are unaware of, right? It's a question of how you regulate that, how you manage that. Do you do it through a kind of language of rights and kind of minimizing of all coercion and recognizing that the state is the biggest agent of coercion and it's a fairly dangerous institution that might actually empower, for instance, as with unions and employers in 18th century England, this kind of domination? Or do you largely view domination as a kind of function of social organization that is controlled by, that is in some sense suppressed and controlled by a well-ordered state? I mean, I think this is basic. Now, my point in the talk is, if you think this is a long tradition that has informed, as they say, our democratic institutions. So this is not some newfangled notion, let's jettison everything, rip up the Constitution, and come up with a new understanding of liberty. What they're saying is, properly understood, the Western tradition of liberty comes from the Romans, through the Renaissance, through the English Civil War, through the American Revolution, onto our Constitution, Charter of Liberties, and so forth. And this is how they understood it, and we've forgotten this. So history can rebuke our assumptions, return us to this original understanding. So partly it's just an historical point, that they lose that rhetorical resource unless they can, not entirely, they can presumably come up with other examples, and but that they're losing part of the force of that if they confront this history. But I also think I would like them to, I think one has to think somewhat critically about the project you're describing, because I think often They purport to be believers in the neutral state, believers in individual end setting, who are merely concerned about domination. Otherwise, people can do what they want in a liberal society. But I think often they show a little too much slip, if you will. I mean, I think to some extent, if you read Mill, if you read this kind of tradition of concern about social domination, if you read Pettit himself, you can read that that is not the only reason they're concerned about certain institutions in our society. They view them as fundamentally defective, that no matter what exit conditions you make legal and so forth, that these basically have to be eradicated as superstitions, atavisms, and so forth. So I think there's a lot more coercion behind the vision than you might think. There's one passage here I thought if I had time I'd read, but maybe I'll read it in response to your criticism. And Pettit, in the preface to Republicanism, writes that he came up with the idea of non-domination while he was training to be a priest. I didn't mention this, but Pettit was in seminary as a boy. While such schools and seminaries offer wonderful opportunities for study and comradeship, they certainly did not teach us to look at the authorities in the eye, confident of knowing where we stood and of not being subject to capricious judgment. On the contrary, they communicated a sense of systematic vulnerability and exposure to the governing will, sometimes making virtue of these practices. I had come to rail against the subordination inherent in such training, and the notion of freedom as non-domination offered a satisfying way of explaining what was wrong with it. Our formation had tried to cultivate unfreedom in us. It was designed to make students passive, unassertive, unsure of where they stood. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote in the 1790s of the way that women's subordination turned them into creatures who learned to bow and scrape to achieve their ends by ingratiation. She might have been writing of us. That reveals a lot, and I think it reveals more than sort of the standard concerns about how domination might work in families that are completely disordered, or how churches, which are cults, might operate. I think it reveals a pretty robust understanding of what a well-ordered, just state would be. I think he's quite hostile to Christianity, and Skinner is notoriously hostile to religion. I mean, he understands this to be a secular tradition that he's recovering. I think he understands it as an alternative to a kind of Rawlsian account of rights that emerge out of religious conscience, because that prioritizes freedom of religion in a problematic way for these guys. So I'm not saying it's decisive. I understand what you're saying. You could accommodate it in various ways, make analogies, suggest that the context is so irretrievably lost we need concern. But what I'm saying, that to the extent that history operates as myth for them and as rhetoric, it's hard to imagine this book being called, dissenters, the dissenting tradition, or tolerationism or something. It's just simply, he's allergic to that kind of thinking.
So you're taking away their Arcadian, basically.
They're what?
They're Arcadian.
Yeah, well, I think I'm somewhat suspicious. He's very, as I say, he's very cagey about, perfectionist liberals can be very aggressive as regards civic associations, religious education is child abuse, churches have to be monitored to make sure their exit conditions are sufficient and so forth. And those of us outside these institutions have a kind of autonomy that they don't have. We're not creatures of our... So the concern about social domination as a creature of environment and sociability and so forth seems to me often partial in the way it's applied. And I'm kind of calling them out for that. But I don't think it's decisive in the way that you might be suggesting I was arguing. Anyone else? Or?
Thank you very much.